2 years ago, I received an acceptance letter from one of my dream universities, along with the incredible news that I had been awarded a scholarship. It felt like the stars had aligned for me. In preparation for college, I had been working part-time, trying to be responsible and save up as much money as I could. My plan was to build a financial cushion, a college fund I could rely on in case I needed money for unexpected expenses, or if the scholarship didn't cover everything. I didn't want to leave things to chance, so I took it to save diligently. Getting accepted to college was already an achievement, but securing a scholarship felt like an additional stroke of luck, as though all my hard work had finally paid off in the best possible way. Hence, I was happy that the college fund I had been saving up could now be used for any additional expenses I would have during college. At the time, I didn't have my own bank account yet. I was still quite young, and for convenience, the money I earned from my part-time job was deposited directly into my mother's salary account. I trusted her completely with it. I had always assumed that when I eventually left for college, my mom would just transfer that money back to me, no questions asked. I had earned it, after all, and it was intended for my education. However, reality turned out to be quite different from what I had expected. Not long after I had received my scholarship, my parents sat me down to talk. They announced, quite casually, that since I had been fortunate enough to receive a scholarship, I no longer needed the money I had been saving for college. They explained that because my tuition would be mostly covered, they wanted to redirect that money I had saved my money for my older sister's future instead. I was completely taken aback. I had worked hard for this money, and now, out of nowhere, they were telling me it would be used for my ungrateful sibling. For some context, let me explain a bit more about my older sister, Caroline. Caroline has always been the troublemaker in the family, unlike me, who's had to work hard and follow the rules. She has always found a way to escape consequences, no matter what she does. She's only 3 years older than me, but you wouldn't think so if you saw how my parents treat her. They act like she's still a little kid, and no matter how old she gets, they seem determined to shield her from any kind of responsibility or accountability. It's like they've put her in a bubble where she never has to deal with the real world. Ever since we were children, Caroline was always the one getting away with it I never could. I was constantly reminded to work hard and be responsible, but Caroline, on the other hand, whenever she made a mistake or did something wrong, my parents, especially my mom, would jump to her defense, almost instinctively arguing that her oldest child could never be wrong. It didn't matter whether my sister was clearly in the wrong or if there were others involved. Somehow, my mother would always manage to turn things around and make it seem like she was the victim. For example, when Caroline was around 14 years old, she got caught bullying younger girls at school. According to the teachers, she had been picking on them for weeks. Things got so bad that the school had to call my parents in for a meeting to discuss Caroline's behavior. It was a serious issue. Several students and teachers had witnessed her bullying. But when my mother heard what had happened, she flat out refused to accept it. Caroline started crying during the meeting, of course, and denied everything. Rather than questioning whether her daughter could really be in the wrong, my mom decided to believe her tears over the facts. She argued with the teachers, even with the headmistress, insisting that Caroline was being unfairly accused. She made up excuses, saying that her darling daughter could never be nasty or mean to anyone, and even went so far as to accuse the victim of acting just to get Caroline into trouble. In the end, Caroline was let go with only a week's suspension, but my mom's refusal to accept the truth meant that Caroline realized that she faced no real consequences. She was never reprimanded for what she did, and life went on as though nothing had happened. Next, when my sister, Caroline, turned 16, things escalated significantly. She got herself into even more trouble this time. She was caught smoking at her school, which, by itself, was already against the rules, but that wasn't the worst of it. Along with smoking, she was also found trying to sell weed, which was a much more serious offense. The school administration, this time, had irrefutable evidence. There were witnesses, too, and it was clear that Caroline had crossed a line that even my parents couldn't argue their way out of. When the school uncovered everything, Caroline was essentially expelled, and that marked a turning point. For once, my mother, who had always been able to shield her from accountability, was suddenly in a position where she couldn't talk her way out of the situation or make excuses for Caroline. Yet, instead of letting Caroline face some consequences at least, my mother quickly switched into what I can only describe as damage control mode. She refused to let this incident tarnish the image she had built of Caroline as the perfect, innocent daughter in this family. Rather than addressing the reality of what had happened, my mom spun an entirely different narrative to our family members and relatives. She started telling people that she wanted to send Caroline to a posh school far away from home because she wanted the best education possible for her. In reality, it was difficult for Caroline to get into any school in our locality because of her reputation. My parents were desperate to hide what had really happened. They couldn't bear the thought of people finding out that their darling daughter had been expelled from school for something as serious as smoking and selling weed. The posh school was just a cover to protect their reputation and, by extension, Caroline's. However, my mom framed it to others as though she was sending Caroline to a prestigious, expensive boarding school of her own choice to give her better opportunities and help her succeed. Of course, this decision came at a huge financial cost. The boarding school my parents chose for her was incredibly expensive, far beyond what my parents could comfortably afford. They struggled to pay for it, but they were willing to make those sacrifices to maintain the image of Caroline being this privileged, well-off girl who was receiving the best education that was far above everyone else living in our neighborhood. Clearly, my parents were willing to go to great lengths to cover up Caroline's failures and bad behavior, even when it meant putting themselves under financial strain. You would think that after everything that had happened after getting caught smoking, selling weed, and being expelled from school, Caroline would have learned her lesson, shown some remorse, or at least made an effort to change. But no, that wasn't the case at all. Shortly after she was sent to that expensive boarding school, my parents received a call one night that Caroline had disappeared in the middle of the night. My sister had left a letter behind, in typical dramatic fashion, declaring that she was in love with her then boyfriend, Nick, and that she couldn't wait any longer to spend the rest of her life with him. Panic set in at home, and my parents went into overdrive trying to find her. They were frantic, calling up her friends and contacting the police, searching for any leads or clues about where she might have gone. Thankfully, after some tense days of searching, the police were able to track her down. Caroline had been staying at one of her friends' houses the whole time. When my parents and I went to get her back home, my sister flat out refused to come back home. Instead, she declared to my parents that Nick was the one for her and that she wanted to marry him immediately. My parents tried to talk her out of it for hours. Rather than laying down the law or demanding that Caroline come back and finish school, my mother in the end, gave in to her demands. After some negotiating, they struck a deal. Caroline would return to finish high school, but after she graduated, my parents would support her decision to marry Nick. They even agreed to help Caroline and Nick financially, as much as they could after their marriage. Can you believe that? And that's exactly what happened. True to her word, Caroline graduated, and as soon as she turned 18, instead of going to college or focusing on her future, she married Nick. My parents, as promised, helped them every step of the way. They found a place for Caroline and her new husband to live in. Since neither Caroline nor Nick had any stable income to support themselves, my parents ended up agreeing to pay their rent every month. And to make matters worse, Nick didn't have any parents around, so the entire responsibility for the two of them always fell on my mom and dad only. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that, after all the trouble Caroline had caused, my parents were still bending over backward to make her life as comfortable as possible. They were using their hard-earned money to support her marriage, pay her rent, and basically take care of her and her husband, while I was always told to focus on studies and encouraged to take a part-time job so I could earn my own money. I couldn't help but feel the growing resentment, knowing that I always had to work harder than my sister who just got things for free served on a platter. This kind of favoritism has been a constant throughout our lives. No matter what Caroline does, she's always protected. And when my parents decided to take the money I had worked so hard to save for my education and give it to her instead, it just felt like another chapter in the same old story. I confronted them, demanding to know why they were choosing to give my hard-earned money to Caroline. It didn't make sense to me. I had been saving that money for years to help with college, and it was mine, not theirs to give away. That's when my parents revealed the real reason behind their decision. Caroline had just found out she was pregnant. My jaw practically dropped in disbelief as my dad proudly declared how happy he was to become a grandfather so soon. Both he and my mom beamed with excitement, completely unfazed by my reaction. For them, this was joyous news, a new chapter, a grandchild to look forward to. But all I could think was, how is Caroline going to handle having a baby when she can't even manage her own life? She and her husband could barely take care of themselves, let alone a child. However, when I voiced these concerns to my parents, my mom just brushed them off, like she always does whenever I raise a valid point about Caroline's poor decisions. She casually mentioned that Nick, Caroline's husband, had recently gotten a good position, so he would be able to support her and the baby from now onwards. My mom said it so matter-of-factly as if this new job would magically erase all of their financial struggles. Then she dropped the real bombshell. My parents had decided to take away the biggest source of tension in Caroline's life by buying a brand new apartment and letting her and Nick stay there for free. That's where they wanted to put my money into purchasing a home for my sister so she could start her family in peace. They were ready to make yet another huge financial sacrifice to buy a house just to make sure Caroline didn't have to worry about anything. I couldn't believe it. It was like everything I had worked for, the late nights, the part-time jobs, the sacrifices didn't matter in comparison to Caroline's latest life event. Once again, I was being asked to step aside so she could be catered to. My parents had never shown this level of pride or excitement about my achievements, not even when I got accepted into my dream university with a scholarship. After years of being the responsible, hardworking daughter who tried her best to make them proud, I was tired of coming second to Caroline in every way that mattered to them. It was a moment of clarity for me. I realized that no matter what I did, I would never get the recognition or appreciation I deserved. If they couldn't value me for the person I had become, then maybe it was time for me to stop seeking their approval altogether. I was done fighting for a place in their hearts. From that point on, I stopped arguing with them. I didn't see the point in trying to reason with people who were so blinded by their favoritism. Instead, I shut down completely, emotionally distancing myself from the situation. I just waited quietly, patiently for my chance to leave. The moment my college start date approached, I focused on preparing for that escape. I kept my head down, counting the days until I could finally move out and leave this toxic dynamic behind. But even in those final weeks, I would overhear my parents talking several times about their grand plans for my bedroom after I left. They were already planning to turn it into a nursery for Caroline's unborn child, their future grandchild. It was as if my existence had been completely erased from their minds. The room I had lived in for years was already being planned to be transformed to cater to a child who hadn't even been born yet. My parents were practically giddy with excitement about how they could babysit for Caroline and give her baby a room in their house. When the day came to move, my dad didn't even offer to help me pack or move my things. Fortunately, I had my friends, who were there for me. They helped me move into my dorm, and once I settled into my new life at college, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under the weight of my parents' favoritism or trapped in a house where my achievements and my efforts were taken for granted. Away from my family, I finally had the freedom to live my life without constantly being compared to my sister or feeling like I wasn't good enough. For the last 2 years, I've been focusing completely on myself. The college has been a busy and fulfilling experience. I've worked hard academically while also holding down a part-time job as a server, and honestly, I love the life I've built for myself. After moving out, I finally felt free from the toxic favoritism that had dominated my family for so long. True to their word, my parents turned my old room into a nursery for Caroline's baby, Jimmy. I've only met him once, briefly, when he was born. Caroline and I have never been close, so we don't really talk, and after it became clear that I had no place left at my parents' home, I stopped going back home altogether. My parents have never really checked up on me these last 2 years unless they wanted something from me, and over time, I just accepted that this was how things were. I focused on my own life, and my own goals, and let go of the idea that they would ever change. Things had been quiet between us for so long that I was genuinely surprised when I received a call from my mom early this morning. She sounded panicked, her voice shaking, and the first thing she asked was whether my sister had called me. I was confused and told her no, I hadn't heard from Caroline. Then, to my surprise, my mother started to cry on the other end of the line. I felt a pang of worry hearing her like that, and I asked her what had happened. That's when she finally confessed, in between sobs, that something terrible had happened that morning. Apparently, she and my dad had woken up to the sound of the doorbell ringing frantically, followed by loud banging on their front door. When they rushed downstairs to see what was going on, they found Jimmy, Caroline's son, standing on the porch all by himself. He was holding his small bag and a note. My mom was in hysterics as she recounted how terrifying it was to open the door and see their grandson there alone, with no sign of Caroline or her husband, Nick. I asked my mom if the note said anything about where Caroline had gone or what was happening. This is when my mom revealed that in the note Caroline had written that she hated being a mother and couldn't live with this suffocation any longer. She wrote how didn't want to raise her son and had asked my parents and me to take over raising Jimmy from that day forward. I was absolutely taken aback, stunned by the reality of what was happening. My mother's sobbing only intensified on the phone as she tried to process this, while my father, who had been desperately trying to reach both Caroline and her husband Nick, suddenly took the phone from her. I could hear the urgency in his voice. He informed me that both Caroline's and Nick's phones had been switched off, and he said that this was starting to be a very grave matter. He recounted how a few days ago, Caroline had asked them for money, so now there was a chance she had actually run away with the money, leaving behind her son with us. My dad told me that it was time for me to come back home immediately to help them search for Caroline. I was still processing everything, trying to wrap my head around the fact that my sister had abandoned her child like this. And while I felt concerned, I also knew I had my own responsibilities. I calmly told my dad that coming home wasn't possible at the moment. I had an important exam coming up this week, and I couldn't just drop everything. I offered to do what I could from my end, saying I'd try to reach out to Caroline myself, but I couldn't be physically there. My dad wasn't happy with that response at all. He started arguing, telling me I was being unreasonable and that the family needed me with them right now. He spoke as if it was my duty to show up, like I had some kind of moral obligation to be there for them in this crisis, just because we're family. But I wasn't about to let him guilt trip me. I argued back, reminding him that my being there wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't help but point out that they hadn't needed me in the past 2 years. Not once had they asked how I was or what I needed. Now, suddenly, because they were in a crisis, I was supposed to drop everything and rush back to help. It didn't sit right with me, and I wasn't going to let them make me feel guilty for focusing on my own life. Then my dad told me how I was being too harsh on them during this time of crisis. He said that all they needed was for me to be there for them, that this situation wasn't about the past or any old family issues. It was about coming together as a family when things were clearly falling apart. He tried to make me feel like I was being cold-hearted for not rushing back to help, as though I was the one turning my back on them in their time of need. Ida, for not letting my dad guilt trip to go back home just because my sister has abandoned her son? Update 1. I completely agree that something feels off about my parents suddenly calling me back home, especially considering how they've barely contacted me in the last 2 years. Now, out of nowhere, my mom, who hardly ever calls me, has been ringing my phone multiple times a day, practically begging me to return. It doesn't sit right with me, and it's hard not to think that there's some ulterior motive behind it. They've never shown this level of urgency about anything before, so why now? To clarify to some commentators, I'm genuinely concerned for Jimmy. The idea of my sister abandoning her child is beyond heartbreaking, and I feel for him deeply. Caroline's sudden disappearance and her decision to leave Jimmy on my parents' doorstep is shocking, to say the least. But at the same time, I know my parents love Jimmy, and I trust that they will take care of him, just as they've always been willing to bend over backward for Caroline's sake. So, I'm not worried that Jimmy won't be cared for. I know my parents will step up for him. At the end of the day, what bothers me the most, though, is how my sister can just vanish without warning. It's disturbing that she would do something so drastic, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on than I've been told. I don't understand why my parents are so desperate to have me come home when, in reality, they've never needed my help before. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update. After I finished my college exam, I decided to take some time and finally visit my parents. My mother, who had been crying for the past week, had red, puffy eyes, and it looked like she hadn't slept much. My dad had this grim, worried expression that made it clear he was still anxious about everything. Jimmy seemed to be doing all right, though. I brought him a small gift and spent some time playing with him. He was comfortable with my parents, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding him. He even seemed to think that his parents were just on a vacation and would return soon. Once I settled in, I knew I needed to sit down with my parents to talk about everything. I wanted to see the note Caroline had left with Jimmy. As soon as I asked my parents to show me the note, I noticed my parents exchanging worried glances, which only heightened my concern. Finally, my mother hesitantly retrieved the note, and I braced myself for what I might read. As I read through it, I was shocked to find that they had left out a crucial part of the truth. Caroline hadn't just abandoned her son with my parents, she had specifically left him for me. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My sister had gone on to write that she resented the way my parents had raised her. She expressed how she wished she could be more like me, someone who was responsible and capable. She ended the note by writing that by leaving Jimmy with me, he would have a better chance at a good life, perhaps even a life she wished she could have had. I looked up at my parents, my heart racing, and demanded to know what the hell was going on. Why did my sister leave me her son? This changed everything. That's when my parents slowly began to reveal the whole story. After my parents had bought them a comfortable apartment to live in, Nick and Caroline started to spiral into a world of drugs and neglected their responsibilities as parents even after Jimmy was born. My parents caught them multiple times leaving Jimmy alone at home, even as a baby, while they went out to party with random strangers late into the night. Both of them would also have violent fights due to their drug use. Caroline would often show up at my parents' doorstep, crying for help with Jimmy in her arms. Hearing all this felt like hearing a story about a stranger. I mean, I have always known my sister causes trouble, but I had thought that at least as a parent, she would have given up on these things, but clearly she hadn't. My parents had knowingly kept this hidden from me. They knew me well enough to understand that I would judge them for supporting Caroline through all of this nonsense. They had tried their best to get her help, even attempting to admit her to rehab, but she would always relapse. At one point, my sister, in dire need of money for drugs, resorted to stealing from them. That's when my parents realized just how dangerous the situation had become, not just for Caroline, but for Jimmy too. They needed to stand up for their grandson and protect him. They were in a position where they felt they had to protect their grandson. This is when my parents threatened to call Child Protective Services on my sister and her husband and have them arrested for neglecting their son. It seemed this threat was what pushed Caroline over the edge. She had been struggling to be a parent for so long, and with their threat, she just couldn't do it any longer. A week before she disappeared, she had asked to borrow some money from our parents. Then, without warning, she left Jimmy on their doorstep and vanished. My parents told me that it was clear that she and Nick were done with being parents. They had knowingly left their son on their porch and both of their phones were unreachable. My parents had registered them as missing. The police were involved, but even they believed that Caroline and Nick had likely left their children willingly, possibly to continue using drugs, which seemed all too likely given the circumstances. As I absorbed everything they were telling me, I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. It was clear that my sister had been suffering for a long time, and yet I had been left completely in the dark. My parents went on to explain that this was the main reason they wanted me to come back home. They obviously could not come right out and tell me the entire truth on the phone since they were afraid of how I would react to everything. My dad then started to say how he and mom were getting older, and while they enjoyed babysitting Jimmy for a few hours, they couldn't possibly handle him full time. Hence, he felt it was a great idea for me to move back in with them and work on replacing Caroline's role in Jimmy's life. My mother nodded in agreement, saying that I could probably drop out of college and raise Jimmy for the time being since my sister wanted me to have him. I was taken aback and couldn't help but laugh at their suggestion. Had they lost their minds? There was no way I was going to drop out to take care of my sister's child. I firmly told them that we needed to talk to CPS about this situation. If I didn't want to take legal custody, then they could step in and become custodians for Jimmy. It felt like the most responsible path forward, given the circumstances. My dad quickly pushed back, saying that this was a family matter and that involving CPS could complicate Jimmy's life. My mom chimed in, arguing that my sister would be disappointed in me if I didn't step up since she had basically left her son to me, insisting that she and my dad expected better from me. Their words struck a nerve. I told them that I didn't care about disappointing anyone. It was about doing what was right for Jimmy and for myself. I needed to think this through carefully before rushing into making a decision that could change my life forever. So, my parents have finally agreed to give me some time to think. Update 3, it's been 2 months since my last update. To clarify a few points, yes, my sister definitely wrote that note. I know Caroline's handwriting well enough to be sure. No, my parents did not fake her handwriting. My parents have shown me bank statements which reveal just how much money my parents were foolishly sending to Caroline every month to help out her and her husband. They even took me to Caroline's apartment, since they had a key too. The apartment was left in a condition exactly as my mother had described to me: empty alcohol bottles strewn on the floor, drawers, and cupboards emptied out, and there was a strong stench that was overwhelming. The refrigerator was practically bare, and the whole place was very filthy. I did contact CPS and shared everything I knew about my sister and her husband's situation. For the time being, my parents have volunteered to take temporary custody of Jimmy, at least until Caroline or Nick return. I feel a bit relieved knowing that Jimmy will be safe with them for the time being. Yes, my parents did try to guilt me a lot to care for Jimmy, but I stood my ground. I knew that making a choice based on guilt wouldn't be in anyone's best interest, least of all Jimmy's. I told them how I could not let their other daughter's bad decisions in life hold me down in my career and life. I pointed out to them that they were facing the consequences of their own actions. No, my parents still haven't apologized for using my college fund. However, they did express regret about buying the apartment for my sister. Just to clarify, the apartment deed is in their name. They were allowing my sister and her husband to live there rent-free. I guess now they're likely going to rent it out and earn some extra money. Currently, I am back in college and focused on my studies. I will continue to visit Jimmy whenever I can.